Hello and welcome to World Talks here on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. Today marks 1,500 days since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, a war now reshaping battlefields, economies and global energy markets. As Kyiv intensifies strikes on Russian oil infrastructure, we assess the impact with Chris York, a news editor at the Kyiv Independent. Chris, welcome to TVP World and thanks for taking the time.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So let's start with an overview. How would you assess the state of the battlefield as it currently stands? Are we seeing some kind of deadlock with no one really moving anywhere fast?
I think, broadly speaking, yes, you could say it's deadlocked. The front lines have moved very, very little in, over a year now. But interestingly, yesterday, President Zelensky had a briefing with journalists in Kyiv. And he told journalists there that he'd seen an assessment from Britain's intelligence service, MI6, which had assessed that actually Ukraine is in one of the best positions that it's been in for a while during the war. And the thing that Ukraine is highlighting, and this is difficult to verify, but they are claiming that the Russian losses are reaching record levels. Again, at the same briefing, Zelensky said that it was 35,000 Russian troops were lost in March. But the key difference here is we've had those numbers in terms of losses for a long time now. But what Ukraine is claiming now is that the proportion of those losses that are killed rather than just wounded is actually skyrocketing. And a few weeks ago, they actually claimed that the sort of ratio of killed to wounded is now at around 2-1. So of all Russian casualties, 62% of them are deaths. And again, it's difficult to verify, but if that is accurate, that is an absolutely astounding figure, which would put it as one of the highest killed to injured ratios of any modern war, like higher even than World War I or World War II.
How's Ukraine managing this kind of ratio, and is it making an impact on Russia's ability to wage war on the battlefield there?
The key change in the battlefield, as everyone I'm sure will be aware, is the use of drones, FPV drones on the front. Obviously, both sides are using FPV drones to target infantry and the other side soldiers. But I think where the difference arises is the fact that Russia continues to throw just insane numbers of troops at the front lines with very little disregard for their life. So they're just being mown down by all of these FPV drones that Ukraine has. And yes, apparently it is having an effect. We know that Russia, most of the Russian soldiers who are fighting in Ukraine aren't mobilized soldiers. They're contract soldiers who agree and sign contracts to go and fight for the military. And we have figures, fairly reliable figures, of how many contract soldiers Russia is recruiting each month. And there was sort of a little bit of a tipping point at the beginning of this year where the number of claimed Russian soldiers killed surpassed the number of soldiers that Russia had managed to, convince to go and fight in Ukraine. And that's been the case now for 3 months straight. So if that trend continues, Russia is basically going to eventually run out of people who are willing to voluntarily sign a contract for vast sums of money, these big sign-on bonuses that they get. And the ready supply of manpower that Russia's relied on for so long is going to start to dwindle. And then Russia is going to have to do something about that to make up those numbers.
Right, well, let's move beyond the battlefield, the front lines for the moment, and look at the drone war in both directions. So Ukraine has certainly stepped up its attacks on oil refinery oil refining assets that Russia has, and it seems to be making an effort, with some numbers going as far as 40% of oil being disrupted. Is that what you're hearing? And does this indicate a shift in the Ukrainian strategy?
It doesn't necessarily indicate a shift in the Ukrainian strategy. They've been targeting Russian oil refineries and Russian ports and oil and gas infrastructure for around about a year now, I believe more than a year. But there's certainly been an escalation in the last couple of weeks. And the Kyiv Independent, we published a piece last week examining the timing of this apparent escalation. And it's hard to draw like firm conclusions without being in the planning rooms of Ukraine's armed forces. But this escalation has coincided with the boost in revenue that Russia is getting from the increase in oil prices globally. So it would make a lot of sense for Ukraine, and obviously I need to point out there that this is the money that Russia is using to fund its war machine in Ukraine. So it obviously makes sense for Ukraine to try and limit the sort of bonus in revenue that Russia is getting from what's happening in Iran by taking out more of its refining facilities and just basically reducing the amount of oil that Russia has to export at these now inflated prices.
Right. What else are we hearing about the shadow fleet? It sounds as though Western countries are finally taking these ships more seriously, boarding them, stopping them from continuing their journey, emptying them of fuel, and so on. Is that having an impact on Russian oil exports as well?
I would suspect not. The Russian shadow fleet in October, was the last figures that I saw, consisted of around 3,200 vessels. And yes, Western nations, the US and France and the UK, have said that they are going to do more to tackle it. And we've had sort of isolated cases of individual ships being boarded, but they are very, very small numbers compared to the size of the shadow fleet that is out there. And the Western countries have been very slow to respond to this. There's a lot more that they can do. And the Kyiv Independent published an exclusive report this week, which exposed that it's actually the shadow fleet is running on Starlink for communications. We managed to interview some sailors who have worked aboard the shadow fleet, and they go to great lengths to hide their location and to stay relatively stealthy and untraceable. But they're using Starlink to communicate. And we already know that Starlink's a sort of a contentious issue in the Ukraine war. And last month, or perhaps the month before, SpaceX and the Ukrainian government took the necessary steps to stop Russia from using it on the battlefield. And that did have an effect on Russia's ability to communicate and to coordinate attacks on the front line. And so there is a case to be made that they should do the same for the shadow fleet and remove a form of communication for the shadow fleet so that Russia can, to help maybe hinder Russia's ability to finance its war.
Right. Okay. Well, I mean, certainly that is an issue that is surprising many, as you say. The Starlink link we thought had been cut off, but clearly not. What about on the other side? Are we seeing a shift in Russian tactics? Their drone attacks seem to be getting more and more accurate, more and more well targeted. They're attacking trains, warehouses, and so on, as well as, of course, civilian properties. But they're doing it in enormous quantities of drones. How effectively are those attacks being defended against?
Overall, considering the numbers of drones and missiles used in these mass missile attacks, it's quite remarkable that Ukraine manages to shoot the vast majority of them down. A couple of weeks ago, we had the largest number of drones launched in 24 hours, and it was over 1,000. And Ukraine's shoot down rate of those was around 97%. And we see how much trouble the Gulf states are having in the Middle East at tackling like nowhere near as big a numbers as that. And yet Ukraine, obviously, sadly, through experience, is pretty adept at shooting down these Russian drones. But we are seeing. I mean, we're very, very used to mass missile and drone attacks in Kyiv. We've had hundreds and hundreds of them for nearly 3.5 years since they started in October 2022. But it's been a little bit surprising last month and this month that these, what are normally nightly attacks, they've started happening during the day. Just this morning, there were 400 drones launched before lunchtime. And we've spoken to experts here and to the Air Force, and the consensus is that Russia is just experimenting with tactics to see what is the most effective way of deploying these drones to cause as much damage as possible. And there were at least 4 people killed and more than 30 wounded just today in mass Russian drone and missile attacks.
Right, so seem to be increasing in intensity and no end in sight for the moment. However, as you say, Ukraine has developed an enormous amount of expertise in the area both of drone defense and drone technology itself, which it's offering to the Middle East to defend against Iranian Shahed drones coming from Iran this time, not Russia. What have we heard about the deals that President Zelensky made out in the Middle East?
Well, I think the main, it wasn't so much a deal so much, but I mean, there's sort of lots of memorandums of understanding, 10-year deals, very solid details on the kind of specifics of it. But obviously last week, Zelensky offered to help out reopening the Strait of Hormuz, which is obviously quite a big deal. And, Ukraine really senses this opportunity to be incredibly useful in the Middle East during this ongoing Iran war. And they've got a window of opportunity to sort of say, like, hey, we can help you guys out here. But it's a deal, right? Ukraine wants something in return. And right now we're in a situation where a lot of the Gulf states have these more expensive and sort of more boutique air defense systems like the Patriot, the US-made Patriot and THAAD systems. And Ukraine has some, and Ukraine really badly needs them because Ukraine is very good at defending against drones, but is not so good at defending against ballistic missiles because they're harder to shoot down, and you need a boutique system like the Patriot or the THAAD to do that.
So you actually do need a mix, don't you, of that kind of boutique system and the drone defense systems. Unfortunately, Chris, we're going to have to end it there, but thank you for coming along and sharing your analysis with our audience, and have a good evening and stay safe.
Thanks.
Bye now. And that brings us to the end of this episode of World Talks. Don't go away, lots more coming up. Goodbye.